Okay, so I think that we ran out of time on that video. Must have been waffling on too much, but so I was just concluding the effect that economic growth had in terms of stabilizing apartheid, in terms of the impact it had on the African population. So it's not the case Africans have become accommodated to apartheid during the 1960s, but it was the case that their own living conditions were not so bad as to drive them into resistance out of sheer desperation. So in this sense, economic growth played a large part in deterring resistance and thus stabilizing apartheid during the 1960s. But economic growth also stabilized apartheid in another way by building up support amongst the white population for apartheid and for the National Party, who were the governing party implementing it. So when apartheid was first considered, remember, in the run-up to the 1948 election, many white people believed it was unrealistic, even unachievable. However, by the 1960s, it appeared not only to be possible, but actually very successful, able to provide a rapidly rising standard of living for the white population in particular. So white wages grew by around 50% over the decade, double the growth in African wages, and remained at levels an average of 12 times higher than African wages. So car ownership also took off amongst the white population around this time, with 1 in 3 whites owning a car by the end of the decade, compared to, they think, probably about 1 in 100 for the black population. And car ownership also became an important symbol of white prosperity. So these rapidly improving living standards for white people boosted support for the National Party and further entrenched apartheid through that way as well. And finally, economic growth also boosted immigration. Now, this is important because whilst migrant workers in the mines mostly came from neighboring African countries, skilled work, as we know, was in the main reserved for white people. So skilled work reserved opportune migrants coming to fill vacancies for skilled positions will mostly come from Europe. And this influx of white workers, grateful for the opportunities and privileges afforded them by the apartheid government, also bolstered and shored up support for the National Party. So you can see, so through these three ways, economic growth strengthened apartheid by reducing the incentive for Africans to resist, by ensuring they were able to, in the main, make a living, by bringing about prosperity for the white population, so that they, in turn, supported the National Party and apartheid, and by bringing in more workers from Europe, that also bolstered the white vote and support for apartheid. In these 3 ways, economic growth played a major role in stabilizing apartheid in the 1960s. So to conclude, then, both factors, both the repression and the economic growth, played an important role. It was economic growth that was ultimately the most important. However, I would argue, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that even with even harsher methods of repression, were unable to stop the tide of resistance in the 1970s and 80s. So this suggests that repression alone cannot explain the so-called quiet decade, because there was even worse repression later, and yet there was still resistance. So what really drives people into resistance, I think, is when the existing system literally does not allow them to live, to earn a living. And in the 1960s, however degrading it may have been, however hated apartheid may have been, economic growth ensured that even those at the bottom of the racial hierarchy were able to make a living, to feed their children, to put food on the table, and even many cases actually gave them a disposable income for the first time to buy, some luxury items and so on. And at the same time, as I mentioned before, these improving conditions strengthened the National Party's support amongst white people even further as well. So ultimately, I would argue, it was economic growth that most strengthened apartheid during this period. Okay, thank you.